Auf Augenhöhe.
Dear community, welcome to another edition at Eye Level from Fellbach. Good evening. Hello. Our big topic today is the business of war. When will we finally move into peace? I would like to talk to my guests about this. I warmly welcome Gabriele Gysi. Hello, Ms. Gysi, I'm pleased. A warm welcome to you. You are an actress, director, and author. This for your information. I am very pleased that you are here.
Yes.
Good evening. I warmly greet Dr. Hans-Joachim Maaz. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Fellbach. It was very important to us to have this side of the issue at the table. You are a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and author. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say on this topic.
Me too.
Hello? Humor cannot be missing from this stark topic, because in my opinion, humor is an outlet that gets you through difficult times. So I greet the cabaret artist Uli Masuth. Hello, welcome. By the way, you are also a composer and pianist. Nice. We don't have a piano, but we will hear a lot from you. I'm looking forward to it and send my warmest regards to Dr. Daniele Ganser. Hello? Historian and peace researcher. Welcome to the group. Yes, it's a big and exciting topic that we want to look at from both an internal and external perspective, because we find both levels very important. We discussed and considered how we should start in preparation for the broadcast. We realized that we only ever talk about the big wars. I mean the external wars that the mainstream media and alternative media talk about. But it's also about the small wars. So about the little wars that we have in our families, with colleagues, with people we may have once loved. Since Corona, possibly due to a split, there has also been a small war or two here. That's why I would like to start with the question to Ms. Gysi. Do you have the feeling that small wars in your personal environment have increased or become stronger in recent years?
In my personal environment, not directly, but rather the other way around. The pressure for war, so the pressure to break away, the pressure to constantly look at everything from the perspective of war. For example, that you always have to assert yourself or present yourself or, it doesn't matter. Every evening we are basically in a celebration of war. The news is just war. And in my environment, thank God, it has brought us closer together. Of course, as soon as it gets a little further away, you are forced into the argument. And the coronavirus has really divided society because these measures and the way they were described didn't allow you to describe a problem. We have become a society that no longer accepts problems, but only knows good and evil and demands solutions. This way of seeing the world is war. This is daily war. I think what we need to learn, I had to do a text for Peace Notes and thought, we really need to learn more about what peace actually is. We no longer know what that is. We watch TV every night, war everywhere. It's no longer like Goethe's Easter walk, where they are beating each other in the distance while we take a leisurely Easter stroll. No. Of course you are right. The war is here and it has two sides. People come together against the war. That is also necessary, I think.
We will talk about this in detail today.
Because we have to learn peace, I would say.
Mr. Maaz, if you listen to Ms. Gysi, what about you? Is there more war or a move closer together in your environment? You said in the preliminary interview that you are currently under a lot of pressure from outside. This is also a form of war that is being waged there.
Just briefly, I make a living from the petty war you just mentioned. This is my daily bread. My job is to help people who actually constantly feel like they are at war, behave like they are in a war, and are mentally in a war. When it comes to problems in the family or partnership, it is actually always the case that the person who comes for treatment initially assumes that they are in the right and that the others, the partner, the father, the mother, are to blame. This may be true at times, but it is still a defensive reaction. You basically deny yourself with your own problems. The first step we have to start with in therapy is to help people recognize themselves as problem carriers. What is your share then? And when I say that now, I'm also talking about a war at the moment, the Great War, and my expertise in this case is not as a historian, but as a psychotherapist, because I know how great the pressure is in many people to wage war. If the partner is no longer enough, or the boss, or the neighbor, or even the politician you don't like, and it accumulates that many people are in the same situation and think in the same direction, then the peer pressure to go to war also grows in society. As a rule, this is actually easier to live with than individual arguments because you can always refer to your orders and say, this is what was ordered, this is what I was ordered to do, this has to be done now. I am not the one who wants to go to war, I am being led there. The great danger that I see today is the latent aggression, the emotional congestion that I keep talking about, and that is present in almost everyone, which is misused for propaganda purposes to divert attention from oneself to an external enemy. On a small scale, it is the spouse, for example, if you are separated, and on a large scale, it is the external enemy in society. We've known this for centuries, I think. In Germany, there has always been the arch enemy, the class enemy. Then there were the Jews, then there were the unvaccinated, and now there are the Russians again. What I'm getting at is this. The collective projection of individual emotions onto a supposedly great opponent is the real danger for us. Here it can happen that the small war turns into a big one.
Mr. Masuth. Small war in your environment?
Not with Ms. Masuth. I just do what Ms. Masuth says and then...
That is correct.
Thanks for this suggested solution.
Then there are no problems, not even in the immediate family. As far as war with friends is concerned, it doesn't happen because friends no longer exist. Yes, it is actually like that. That's where a lot of paths really diverged for me. And apart from that, I think that conversations help. No matter what form they take, you should just have them. If we're talking about a big war now, I think that diplomacy is a better way to find a good solution than throwing grenades at the enemy. Yes. In my current cabaret program entitled Lies and Other Truths, there is also a long section on Ukraine. What I don't actually talk about, because you'll immediately get into trouble, Section 130 of the Penal Code, sedition, and so on. I approach it by saying, suppose I were to talk about this topic, which of course I would never do because of the problems that would then arise. The final sentence is actually the question, what comes after the war? After war, there comes peace at some point, and I think we can just leave the war out.
Mr. Ganser, the war you are waging, the war against critical people, but also the war in your environment. Mr. Masuth said he has lost friends. What has it been like for you in recent years?
I didn't really have any problems with my wife and children. It went well with my friends, but it was actually more difficult with the mayor in Dortmund. I wanted to give a lecture and he forbade me, something I've never experienced before. Really not. Then the mayor in Nuremberg heard about it and thought, great idea. I also forbid the lecture in Nuremberg. Something has already happened that suddenly freedom of speech is being interfered with. I've never experienced that before. Then at some point the court took over the case and processed it. I have given many lectures, but this is the first time.
Over 900.
Yes, over 900 in 20 years. Let's get back to the topic. The fact that it has to be submitted to the court, whether I can even speak, is new, but that is now the case in Germany. This shows that, as Mr. Maaz says, there is a certain bottleneck of emotions. I don't know exactly what it is, but something is there. The court then said I could speak. Then the mayor in Dortmund said, no, I don't want that. Then it went to the next instance. And then the next instance allowed the lecture. That was the Münster Higher Administrative Court. And then the Mayor König in Nuremberg heard it. And then he said, okay, then he can speak here too. So it works.
Smart decision.
But it's definitely a tense time, that's true. I actually have that feeling.
Was that surprising for you too?
Yes, then there was. I was in Dortmund. There was a demonstration for me. People demonstrated and said, yes, freedom of expression and Mr. Ganser is allowed to speak. There was a demonstration against me. Then the police came and then there were 2,000 people at the lecture. So all in all, quite a commotion, and that's something. It's still difficult to assess exactly what this is, but there is something going on.
But I also think, for example, maybe because after 40 you essentially consist of occupational diseases, exactly the opposite. So I think that the kind of tension and pressure and existential pressure that comes from all sides and bombards people also makes them aggressive and allows the potential for aggression to grow within them. And unfortunately, they have no point of reference to really express and live it out. It's clear to me that, in this case, the individual conflicts can escalate ad infinitum because you're always at the limit and on the verge of going crazy anyway. So, for example, I was recently with craftsmen in a car repair shop. By the way, I would like to send you my best regards. By the way, I'm supposed to say hello to you.
Really?
Yes, they're all, well, these are greetings to you. But I will say it shortly, also greetings to Switzerland.
Thanks.
Yes, actually, I thought, speaking of occupational illnesses, I first perceived the pressure, so to speak, and then what does it do to the individual? This is my job as an actress. I have a text that is an abstraction and what is really happening now. So I think exactly the opposite of you. And then I think as an actor, you're basically tasked with developing a mindset for the character and bringing that character to life. And then I realized that there are things that you can't get around. So, for example, he is Swiss and is a smart man. But this neutrality of Switzerland as an element on this earth, I will put it this way, is as if personified. So if I had an actor who had to play you, the first thing I would say is, the man always tries to be neutral. He tries to weigh things up and understand things and faces everything. And then you can start playing something. Every person has different starting points. Every person has different starting points. He then understands the individual. And yes, now I actually just wanted to say what I was getting at, that we have to learn peace and accept different starting points, and that we also have to understand different starting points.
That's why this format exists, with the purpose of allowing us to talk to each other here. And we also see ourselves, as I keep saying, as a piece of the puzzle, because we don't have the absolute truth here either, but rather a piece of the puzzle. And that brings us back to the key word responsibility. Responsibility to educate yourself in the media and to get your own idea of the current situation. And above all, to consider this. Before you start making judgments, you should really think about the person or the thing in general.
And take pleasure in the fact that the other person has a different position. Otherwise, you would just spend the whole day with yourself. Otherwise, you would only have to do with yourself all day.
Mr. Maaz?
I am still preoccupied with Mr. Masuth's statement that he is fine because he does what his wife tells him. I thought about that for a moment. That's when I got the image. That must be a fantastic woman because he's a neat person.
Yes.
Well, if only that were the case in politics. Obviously, a lot of things in politics are done by people who unfortunately cannot be admired as much as Ms. Masuth. Or when I think about what is being done in Germany in the interests of the USA, this model, where I only follow what my closest partner or manager or whoever tells me to do, can't be good. That can't be a good thing. You really have to research. What's so great about Ms. Masuth? Well, I mean, yeah, what's so good that it's worth doing what she recommends? That would really be a model. But to create this model, one would have to find out what is their quality. Yes, that was important to me again because I'm excited about it.
This means that you will also use it from now on.
Yes. Well, in fact, when someone comes, I always ask how. So the individual sick person is never the real sick person or the only one who is sick, but he is always sick in a system. The system is family, the system is partnership, the system is the world of work, and of course society. As a psychotherapist, I can't do anything other than be political, because I see how people get sick in the social conditions in which they have to live. And I lived in the GDR for 40 years, and have now lived in the whole of Germany for over 30 years, and have experienced the huge difference firsthand. In the East, people got sick because they felt too restricted in every way. And if therapy succeeded in making them more open, more critical, they suddenly became politically conspicuous, endangered, and subversive. And then the West came, and people often suffered from always having to present themselves, always having to be better than they really are. And when they were treated therapeutically and they became more natural, they lost their market value. So they were no longer as successful socially as they had been before in their ill life. You noticed a decline. Yes. In view of this, the question of the social values that influence people is, for me, a crucial question when it comes to helping people. And I cannot treat the individual or help him become healthier, more honest, if he has to return to sick conditions.
I would like to continue the discussion later. I would like to take a chronological look into the past. I mean, one might actually expect that we as humanity, we are already very advanced technically, also morally, that we would actually be able to avoid wars. But that brings me to a fundamental question. Mr. Ganser, have there ever been times without wars?
Worldwide?
At the same time? Yes.
No. So for the last 2,000 years, there has always been a violent conflict somewhere in the world. There was, of course, a local period in Europe between 1945, you could say, and 1999, when Serbia was bombed, when there was local peace in Europe, in Western Europe. But Vietnam was bombed at the same time. The Korean War, an overthrow of the government in Iran in 1953. In Guatemala, the government was overthrown in 54, and in Chile and Pinochet in 73. That was a dictatorship. At the same time, they sold weapons to Iran, the Iran-Contra affair, and then used these weapons to arm the Contras. The British fought the Falklands War, and I could go on a bit longer. We have been in this war business again and again.
In dieses Kriegsgeschäft reingestiegen. Auch jetzt beim Ukraine-Krieg, der ja viele beschäftigt, fällt mir einfach auf, dass diejenigen, die profitieren, eigentlich in der Rüstungsindustrie sitzen.
So the defense industry in Russia and Germany benefited, and the defense industry in the USA also benefits, and it's the same in other places. Then you ask yourself, who is fighting the war? These are young Ukrainians and young Russians, and they shoot each other, but they don't really have a problem with each other. And my suggestion would be that the older men, yes, the people my age and a little older, 50, 60, 70, are the shareholders in the defense companies that have to go to the front. Then the war would be over. Because these are different interests. These are really different interests because the shareholder of Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Rheinmetall naturally has an interest in the war lasting as long as possible. And then, of course, he accepts the damage in the war zone because it's not his and he can easily think, that's not my son. And that means, that of course struck me with your statement where you said, as long as the system is sick, as long as war is a business and so on. From a historical perspective, the system is tainted, the incentives are wrong.
It's a bomb business, it really is a bomb business, and they pretend it isn't.
Of course, war is a bomb business for some, and others are traumatized, and the next ones pay with their lives. And now, the British want to supply tanks with depleted uranium, and depleted uranium is armor-piercing ammunition. If this is used in Ukraine, then we will have problems. It has already been used in Serbia and is carcinogenic. This ammunition is being used in Iraq, but it is very cheap. Yes, it is very favorable. In purely capitalist terms, of course, military experts say that makes sense, but the people on the ground are being contaminated. Then they say, but there are two different groups.
But to be clear again, you say for 2,000 years, is there also knowledge from before that?
Yes, they are, but they are controversial. Yes, I don't want to say we were always at war everywhere. But of course, the majority of humanity is perfectly capable of not killing each other. This is important, yes. And resolving conflicts through discussion is actually what we call culture. Yes, and that is dominant. There are great cultures of conversation. There are cultures where you solve problems, and you can say that the largest areas were, of course, peaceful, because then, in times of peace, a prosperous culture really emerges. But on the other hand, if you look across the globe, there has always been war in one corner or another. But the quality of the confrontation has reached another level because we are many more people. So in 1800 we were a billion. Now 200 years later there are 8 billion of us. And what's more, we've had nuclear weapons since 1945. Before that, the possibility of destruction was simply smaller. But now, from 45 to now, we have nuclear weapons, and two nuclear powers are facing each other in Ukraine. So the USA has 6,000 nuclear bombs, Russia has 6,000 nuclear bombs, and now a learning step would probably be necessary. And the political elite does not see this competence.
Since this nuclear armament, I believe that the question of whether there is a just war has also been answered. I say no, although people like to differentiate even now again between a war of aggression and a war of defense. But from my point of view, it is like this. Whoever is for war, whoever supplies weapons, in my eyes is for death, for killing. And if Ukraine must not lose. Anyone who says that as a politician at their desk says, I'm for killing, I'm for tens, hundreds of thousands of deaths. Anyone who says something like that is... And when it comes to the question of social values, for me the concept of normopathy is, so to speak, that a society goes into an undesirable development, but considers this to be normal because the majority thinks and acts in one direction. And that seems to be the case now. In my opinion, normopathy is the wrong way to live. And false life is always an addictive development, so it must come to a crisis. There is no way around it. And we are in this crisis, and there is a growing danger that people will try to solve it, not through insight, through reason, through correction, but through war as a last resort. So I still remember when Erich Honecker flew to Chile with the Red Front and made the fist gesture there. Well, back then he showed absolute lack of insight into his actions and his mistakes. This means that people who are in this normopathy trap are no longer able to correct their behavior or recognize mistakes. They can no longer admit mistakes because they would then have to question their whole life. And that is the real danger of the drive, that the wrong life in the emotional jam leads to war.
Yes, but I mean, if now... In this sense, there are, of course, many normopathies of individual people, but they do not lead to war. People used to say he has a quirk, he's like that. But war usually arises through completely different structures and possibilities. And certainly there have always been foci of conflict, but today, through propaganda and also through military technology, we have means of war that are more destructive than ever before in history. But unfortunately, these are also means of seducing people. Among other things, I'm also talking about the incredible possibilities of permanent sound from outside, which also separates you from everything. You then have to look for the flower in order to concentrate on it. But even that is pushed back into a presentation. We are the good guys. We look at flowers. So that too is formulated in a warlike manner. Not, I just look at flowers and then it's fine. No, the other person is looking the wrong way, and not the other individual, but the group, and you can also name that. The United States, for example, has developed a propaganda technique that is spreading across the entire world. And of course, that seems terrible to me. Because I notice how cultural achievements that were achieved in Germany, for example, in the theater, in language, in literature, are being swept away. And it really happens structurally and with full intention and full consciousness. And unfortunately, as a result, young people are denied access to it. And that's no fun, because we have to perceive ourselves as human beings in the difference. When Bill Gates says on TV at Easter, 7.2 billion people have to be vaccinated, I sit in front of it and think, what's wrong with the poor man? But that's no use. So his narcissism has meaning, and the narcissism of others has no meaning.
I would like to bring Mr. Masuth in sometime.
Why now?
No?
Someone once explained it.
Mr. Masuth, you are a narcissist.
Although we do not use the term correctly.
Yes. We'll then do our own show about it.
Yes.
No, but when you hear it now, including what Mr. Ganser says, and you just gave such a nice quote, let's just try it without war. Is that realistic for you? Humanity without war? What are your thoughts on this?
It depends on how you define war. Yes? Well, if I imagine two children in a sandpit going at each other because everyone wants the red mold, you could call it a war. Yes? What we are currently experiencing with Ukraine is simply on a larger scale, a different dimension. But even here, it is somehow remarkable to see that the so-called values West is not actually waging war. So only the Russians wage war, i.e. the evil Russians. And that's another thing that I can't get my head around. A lot of people in the media always work with double standards. Yes. So why, for example, is Barack Obama somehow portrayed as a hero? Yes. And Vladimir Putin is the monster. Why was there no media outcry when Barack Obama bombed Syria, Yemen, and Libya in violation of international law? Yes. And the outcry on the other side is deafening when Russia invades Ukraine. I mean, it can't be because Vladimir Putin doesn't have a Nobel Peace Prize, so... And when I consider what Mr. Maaz just said, i.e., if the normopaths can't come down from their normopath trip and just keep going, then I really don't see a good ending for any of us. Yes? So I think the next topic will clearly be climate. So when Corona is dealt with, and then Ukraine, and then when we are still alive, then comes climate. And if nothing changes in the government or we can't change anything, then my view is really dark.
Yes. Yes, war is being waged all the time and war is being conveyed through the media. And it is the goal that we should only be in a state of war all the time. And I think that's exactly what, well, if we don't have the awareness of what's happening to us, what's being done to us, then we have it war inside us and then it no longer bothers us outside, or am I looking at that wrong?
Yes.
This is because we are used to war, because war is supposed to be part of everyday life. But that's not the case. The people are actually nice. I insist on that.
Yes, this is the...
So... Yes. That's my favorite thing too, being nice to people. But when it comes to the question of why there is such a desire for war in Germany again, I have to be convinced of the opposite. Namely, what does it take for peace? What does peacemaking actually mean? And in analyzing these connections, I realized that the ability to be at peace equals the ability to love. In other words, I can only be at peace with the outside world if I am at peace with myself.
I'm in love.
Am in love, am at peace with myself, agreeing with who I am, being content and being in love. So the beautiful Bible saying, love your neighbor as yourself, Mark, I believe, was that. In my opinion, this has ruined the church a lot. In my opinion, this is the case because it is assumed that every person would love themselves. This is not true at all. The opposite is actually the case. So most people are not able to love themselves at all, or have a false idea of how good they are by having achieved something again, having bought something, having external success.
We are beaten down from the start in that sense. We are in self-love, and then people immediately say that if you love yourself too much, you are a narcissist, although that is something completely different, at least according to my definition.
This is the crucial question when we come to it again. What can we do? How can we help people come to peace with themselves? Only then, well, I say a sane person would never go to war. So that's quite different from self-defense, which is individual. But in war, others are killed for you. Yes? So the healthy person actually wants to live in peace. Unfortunately, it often happens that he often cannot. It was spoiled for him in his early history by being trained, by not being confirmed, and by never being told, be the way you can and want to be. But always, you have to be the way we want you to be. Parents, teachers, society. And so his capacity for love in himself, and thus his capacity for peace, is actually ruined forever. And then the result is emotional congestion. And if you are in emotional gridlock, you either get sick or angry. There is no other alternative.
Mr. Masuth, yes. Then Ms. Gysi.
Regarding the keyword church, in my opinion, the people who preach this phrase have completely failed in the last 3 years. Yes, well, I have a church background myself. I studied school music, but I had a part-time job as a church musician for many years in the Catholic Church. And how do I best express myself now? So you can really scrap them. Yes, so the church, so I can tell you 2 things very briefly. I've been living in Weimar for 14 years. I'm actually originally from Duisburg, but we then moved. Exactly. I'm an Aussie with a West German migration background. Wassi, exactly. So, the superintendent here in Weimar is called Hinrich Herbst, and he actually did it. In the Sunday sermon from the pulpit, he did not compare the Monday walk, which also takes place in Weimar, with Nazis, but rather he equated them. You have to think about it, he equated them. Yes, and then? I only know this because a friend of mine was at the service and then she jumped up and left the church. And because they knew each other, he said afterwards that it had been a misunderstanding. No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. And the prayers for peace that were said about us were actually pure agitation. Really, my ass. Love your neighbor, there's nothing left of it. And the few that there are, like Jürgen Flieger, he should be mentioned, or Martin Michaelis, they are simply put against the wall in the media, in the right corner.
That's the case with everyone. So you can see that it's March 30th today. We're recording this program today, and I just read today that Mr. Stefan Aust, made critical comments on the climate story. It will be interesting to see how long it takes before the first article comes out that he has lost his way. Yes, we had a guest here in Fellbach one day who was there and came afterwards and said to me, I have to tell you, I was originally a member of the left. I left there on the grounds that they had accused me of being a right-wing leftist. It's not a joke.
Beautiful.
Exactly, yes, but these are all absurd auxiliary constructions.
So the Nazis are not Nazis now. Antifa is not Antifa. The swearers, I don't even know what that is supposed to be. These are word inventions, kindergarten level. So you have thoughts, can you exchange arguments or not? I say, well, whatever interests me. I can't convince 7.2 billion people of this or that. But I can try to understand why others do this or do that. It is also important to try to understand which structures lead them to the point where something like this happens as a result, and that they act the way they do. And for example, to start off big, I have criticism. Our Western so-called community of values has lost its enlightenment. We are no longer able to distance ourselves from ourselves. And we struggle with other civilizations, the Iranian one. An ancient civilization. I was there now from December 17th to January 7th. What is reported about the country is wrong and the contradictions are not understood. Chinese culture, an ancient culture. Russian culture is older than our German culture, just to name it. And states are not created, as is believed in the USA, by sticking a flag somewhere, blowing it in, briefly killing the Indians, and then everything is fine. As you can see, for me, the world is a stage in the Shakespearean sense. And I can tell you, for example, apart from Ukraine, in this Iran trip, a quick overview, We drove a total of 5,000 kilometers through 10 cities. The largest gathering of people was in front of a Belgian chip shop in Isfahan. About 40 people. Yes. The problems described here do not exist there. I wanted to take the bus because men and women are separated. We then took the subway. I was able to persuade our tour guide because he told me what Iranian men are like. They are macho, always have the last word, and the last word is, "Yes, I'd love to, darling."
Okay.
I also made use of this. He didn't want us to travel on any form of public transport. At the end, he said, "Yes, I'd love to, darling." So we get on the subway. What's arriving? A train, a single compartment. I say you not only have to believe what the BBC says about Iran, but you also have to take the subway yourself. It was very nice, and now I don't want to expand further about Iran. All I'm saying is that it's a culture we have no idea about. It is the most hospitable country on earth, and our foreign minister says we shouldn't go there. The type of description is absurd, and to fully illustrate my ignorance, we were in Gom on the last evening. There are currently celebrations for Fatima. Fatima is a prophetess. Where do we have that in Christianity? So they have a prophetess and everyone makes a pilgrimage there. And I don't understand anything that these people do. But I can hear them singing. I see how they occupy themselves with something that you can call God, that you can call nature.
A woman helped us through this.
She took us through these several mosques that are there as a complex. A wonderful, delicate woman who speaks better English than we do. But a highly educated woman who could show us where the most beautiful places are. And when I said goodbye, I hugged her. And I felt like this. I'm so scared that something will happen to her, that will hurt her, that we won't understand something again, that we have been colonizing and colonizing with our idiotic weapons since the 19th century and never look at what we are doing. And that is our task. My job cannot be to change anything elsewhere. But saying here that it's not right and not the individual honestly doesn't matter to me in this case. He should go to you and then you have to help him.
Mr. Ganser, that's what it really means to go there yourself?
You don't come back there and think you have to bomb them.
No.
So most people, when they travel, go to Iran, go to China, go to Cuba, go to Brazil, go to Nigeria, go to South Africa, go to India, even go to France or Switzerland. They then come back, and whether they liked it or not often has to do with the food. Yes, or whether they have met someone they like. But very few people come back and say that we have to bomb it. But I mean it quite honestly. And that's why I thought it was a very nice description. You could feel this love for people, and I think that's actually what we all have. I always say we are one human family. Fortunately, we look different, speak different languages, have different beliefs, have read different things and experienced different things, and that's wonderful. It would be bad if we all looked the same and had the same experience. That would be tragic. So diversity is actually something really valuable, but the human family is being divided by other people. And they said it very well. Those who sit in the media or in politics and say that the Iranians are evil, the North Koreans are evil, the Russians are evil anyway, the unvaccinated are evil too, or whoever else has been hit. An enemy image is always portrayed, and this is then vehemently pushed through the media all the time. And when you say that I am against arms deliveries, I am completely with you, Mr. Maaz. Germany should not supply arms to Ukraine. then they immediately say, then you're a Nazi. So that's it. If you look at it, think about it, then we're in a bit of a crazy state. And what I find nice here is that we can talk together and that people let each other talk. And you can also say, I am against arms deliveries. I watched how Ulrike Guerreau felt when she said this on Markus Lanz on ZDF. The woman is very smart, very nuanced, very committed to peace. The poor lady was shouted down by a whole group of other guests, and that's why I'm glad I'm here with you.
We are too.
Because it gives the wrong impression. Because Mr. Lanz, I don't know how many guests he has, maybe 5? Yes, and then there are...
I don't have a TV.
Good idea? Yes, but then 3 of them spoke against Ulrike and really put the squeeze on her. And then the television viewer thinks that the majority is probably in favor of it. And that is, of course, a subtle manipulation because I don't think that's the case at all. Very few parents tell their children that if they have a problem at school, take a gun with them.
Yes, and that's insane.
It's really bad what they did to Ulrike. So it was really bad. It was so bad because they wanted to constantly force Ulrike Guerreau to confess personally instead of speaking on a meta level, exactly not personally, but understanding something that you personally can't even understand at the moment. And this way of individualizing everything automatically leads to the fact that there must be evil. And if Ulrike Guerreau doesn't say on the show that the Russian is evil, as Ms. Strack-Zimmermann would say at any time, then it's outrageous that she has such an opinion. So actually you should say, Ms. Strack-Zimmermann, please go to Mr. Maaz, you're not feeling well. We can see that. And then please switch on your brain, not your feelings, Ms. Strack-Zimmermann.
She has none.
I don't want to get involved at all. I have a different theory. The lady also has feelings.
But forgotten.
No, she feels. I would never deny her as an actress again. Every person is playable.
There are as many centers in the world as there are people.
Only Ms. Strack-Zimmermann doesn't belong on television, and Ms. Strack-Zimmermann is pursuing horrific, deadly policies, and she defames. She defames people sitting next to her. So, for example, because I'm also directing, I have to say now, I would always like to say, dear Ms. Strack-Zimmermann, you're exaggerating a bit, calm down, drink a coffee first, and then think about the argument, find a counter-argument for it, and think about it calmly. And the counter-argument can never be, my counterpart is worse than me. If I take out this argument, then it is no longer an argument, then it is defamation. And it is exactly what is planted in our brains every day. And Putin is a case study. This clever man who has completed several studies, who acts with great responsibility. The way he does it, I might do it differently than him, but I can't deny it. I can't deny it to anyone.
But is that acting with responsibility? He is fighting a war and people are dying.
That's correct.
I'm stumbling over this right now.
So I think if you take Ukraine apart, in 2014 there was a coup staged by the USA in Ukraine. You can't say that. I'm glad it can be said here. Often it is cut out, but not here. We know each other. And Putin knows that. He knows that this coup has taken place. And if we simply don't talk about it in Switzerland or Austria or Germany, then the coup won't just go away because of that. It's also not okay. We don't talk about it. Then the question arises, did the USA, did Victoria Nuland, the deputy foreign minister, carry out this coup? In my opinion, yes. And then there was a civil war. That is very important. That was cut away, the 8 years of civil war, which claimed 14,000 lives. That is from 2014 to 2021. And then in 2022, Putin invaded. I think the invasion is illegal. You can discuss it, in my opinion, illegally. Ukraine should not have invaded Russia either. But it is an illegal coup by the USA in 2014 on the one hand, and an illegal invasion by Russia on the other. That is my analysis. Then Germany could actually be neutral and say, Washington is involved in crimes, Moscow is involved in crimes, we should mediate. Yes, but instead Chancellor Scholz is siding with Zelensky, even though Zelensky fought a civil war for 3 years. He came to power in 2019, 2020 and 21, that's 3 years, when the Russian wasn't there yet, the invasion wasn't here yet. Zelensky waged civil war against his own people for so long, and that was simply ignored by the media. That didn't exist because we had Corona back then, okay, so we hadn't talked about it, and that's really how a reality is created via television. They say, we're not interested in the deaths in Ukraine right now. Yes, that was when Zelensky was leading the civil war, because we had Corona, and then bang, the Corona issue was gone, and now we're interested in the people in Ukraine, but only those who died after the Russian invasion.
If you say it like that now, in retrospect, Corona was also a war against humanity. With all these measures, with what we have done with children and with old people, perhaps that is why people are simply accepting this war in Ukraine. In other words, you can no longer defend yourself against it.
I don't know exactly, but I'll just say that it's striking if I observe it from a bit of a distance that the civil war from 2014 to 2021, as I said, didn't exist. Various media say there has been a war for a year, which is not true. There has been a war for 9 years, and then they say, yes, the Russian invasion is illegal. I agree it's illegal, but you don't say that the US coup is also illegal, but rather that you're engaging in a very selective historiography. And that reminds me of something I investigated in my studies. If I may explain briefly, I researched the Cuban Missile Crisis, was 25 and a history student at the University of Basel. So I bought like a stack of books, and then I read the first book. It said the Russians brought nuclear missiles to Cuba. So Nikita Khrushchev brought these nuclear missiles to Fidel Castro. Then I thought, this Nikita Khrushchev, what is he doing? That's dangerous because it could lead to a nuclear world war. And that was a book written by the Americans. And that began in October 1962, right from the moment the missiles were discovered until the moment the Russians withdrew them. And I thought that was an objective presentation. Then I have a second, third, fourth book. And then in the fourth book, it said that a year earlier, in 1961, the CIA, which carried out the Bay of Pigs invasion, tried to overthrow Fidel Castro. Then I realized that this was somehow not right, and then I looked at all the documents, and then President Kennedy recorded everything that was said in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then it was very interesting. Then he said to his advisor, yes, Khrushchev, he's crazy too. Is he putting nuclear missiles in Cuba? It's like putting nuclear missiles in Turkey. And then his advisor says, yes, Mr. President, we did that. But Kennedy didn't even know it. Yes, the presidents sometimes don't know where all the nuclear missiles are. And that is also the situation in which the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved at the end, in which each side actually said that we were withdrawing our nuclear missiles. The Americans have said we are withdrawing ours from Turkey, and the Soviets said we were withdrawing ours from Cuba. And that was the deal. And every president told his people, I won, the other one left, and they didn't talk about their own. So that was still possible back then. But I simply say that we lack that today. We don't look at the other perspective at all. We don't look at how the Chinese see it, how the Indians see it, how the Russians see it, how the Brazilians see it. I mean, Scholz went to Lula da Silva, to the president of Brazil, and told him, Lula, you also have to supply weapons. Lula said, no, it always takes two to argue. Lula da Silva said that confidently, which is not reported here. Or then, if I do a global analysis, I would say that the German energy infrastructure has now been blown up on September 26, 2022. Nord Stream, yes. Then Germany, if you had a government that insisted on national interests, you would have had to clarify that. But now I'll cut a long story short. Just a few days ago, there was a vote in the UN on whether this should be investigated independently. The Russians, the Chinese, and the Brazilians were also in favor, and the others said, no, you don't have to examine it. So these are crazy times, aren't they?
That's when you realize how important Switzerland is.
What? How important? Switzerland is currently on the UN Security Council and has remained neutral. They didn't want to investigate it. The Swiss don't dare to do anything either. I am an exception. I'm just saying it doesn't work that way. But the Swiss government, yes, they didn't say, we want an independent investigation into this terrorist attack, at least on the German energy infrastructure, and they just pretend, no, there was nothing, or yes, it doesn't matter. I don't know why, but they don't care. They say we didn't see it, or there were 6 Ukrainians with a fishing boat. I mean, what level is the discussion at? Because I then saw the same people who were there at the ARD fact-checkers. I have to tell you that briefly. Can I still?
We have time. So Mr. Masuth just gets 20 minutes.
I don't want to take up too much speaking time, but I just found this story indicative of how the discussion is going here. The American journalist Seymour Hersh said in February, these pipelines were blown up by Joe Biden and of course, on behalf of him, he didn't go there himself, and then there was just silence. Nobody said anything. There was simply silence. And then the fact-checkers from ARD come and have read the article by Seymour Hersh. And then he says that combat swimmers went into the Baltic Sea. In June 2022, there were NATO maneuvers with 50 ships, 7,000 soldiers, 14 nations, so it was quite a mess in the Baltic Sea. And during this maneuver in June 2022, the American combat divers went down and placed this explosive called C4 on the 4 pipelines. And then Seymour Hersh's text says, planted explosives. Planted means you plant the explosives, attach the explosives, and then comes ARD, 8 billion. 8 billion are the fees they have. And then they say that Seymour Hersh said it was plant explosives. This is true?
But you can say that they write the programs for Mr. Masuth.
No, but they really did say that. When I read that, I said, the ARD fact-checkers say Seymour Hersh is not right because it can't be plant explosives. Then I said, he didn't even write about plant explosives. I'd read the same article before, and at first I thought, what are they doing? And then I saw that they thought that planted means setting explosives, that this word means plant, but then they don't even know English. And then you really don't know when you talk about acting, is it tragedy or comedy? Because these are the same ARD fact-checkers who then go and say, you can't listen to this Ulrike Guerreau. Yes, and Gabriele Gysi, a very smart woman, you shouldn't listen to her. I was then also mentioned, you can't listen to me either. For me, this means that the discourse in Germany or the analysis in Germany has not yet reached its full potential.
Impressive. Mr. Masuth, how political is the cabaret artist?
Very. Just to comment on that. You have to use the fact checkers or fact finders, I think they're called. Fact finder, fact inventor. They also took a very scientific approach. They looked for someone, a specialist, who then said, "There's no such thing as this plant explosive." Yes. And after the matter was published, this scientist, of course, got wind of it, and of course saw himself in the wrong light, and then corrected how he had received the matter. So he didn't know anything about it. He was just asked if there was such a thing. Is there such a thing as plant explosives?
Plant-shaped?
Somehow they conveyed it that way. So the good man didn't know anything about this incorrect translation, so you have to give him credit for that.
Then the problem is ARD.
Always.
Immer.
I have another bon mot. Volker Braut, is he known? Is known.
But perhaps you can briefly explain who Volker Bräutigam is? He used to work for the Tagesschau.
Exactly. He was an editor at Tagesschau for 20 years, and he's been retired for a long time. And he and a colleague, Klinkhammer, they have now written 500 program complaints to ARD. So it's just about misrepresentations on the Tagesschau, things like that. And there is one sentence in the interview that I will never forget. He has said that the announcement, "Here is the first German television with the Tagesschau," is the tally-ho to attempted dumbing down of the people. Well, I think it's not the same with the weather report. I wouldn't say the same for all news, but the Tagesschau is the battleship of opinion-making, yes. And anyone who still thinks that the Tagesschau doesn't have an opinion is beyond help.
And at this point, I would like to say that it is also very difficult for individuals to find their way around today. With so much effort on information that is not knowledge, but rather opinion disguised as information, goodness pretended to be information, it is incredibly difficult for a normal person to keep track of it. And you also have to work, bring up your children, earn money, and pay the rent. How are people who are in work supposed to manage all this? I now have the great good fortune of being able to spend my life thinking about why someone does something and to show respect to everyone. Otherwise, you can't play as a character. And since everyone is a character and is playable, they must first be respected. And that is very difficult to understand. That's really mean. And in this respect, I think our culture needs to be fundamentally criticized. So I'm happy to repeat myself at this point.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Maaz about your view. You've just explained it with normopathy, but what kind of process was that? You also wrote a book, The Normopathic Society. So how did we get to this point, Mr. Maaz?
So maybe I'll explain it like that. I now distinguish between an external democracy and an inner soul democracy. We have or had an external democracy. This is always a game of democracy in certain roles. The legislature, executive, judiciary, and the media landscape would practically have to correct and criticize. The experience I have had, this kind of external democracy, this kind of democratic game, also works with psychopaths, works with criminals, works with the seriously ill. Germany has proven that. So, after the Third Reich, the Nazis were quickly installed again in the Federal Republic, in the economy too, and also in the legal profession. After the GDR, the former Stasi people quickly became active again as managers in the West and also found employment in the Bundeswehr themselves. So that works. This only works for a while, in my opinion, as long as this democracy game somehow fobs off the majority. So consumption, animation,
Entertainment.
entertainment, social security too, of course. And it works even when there's a crazy person there. There could actually be a lot of crazy people. The thing is that these put each other into perspective again. If there is freedom of expression, real plurality, and the rule of law, no madman can really come to power, so the negative effects of crazy people are put into perspective. But if this development is a normopathy, and in my opinion it is, it must come to a crisis, because normopathy is wrong living. That can't work. It will eventually lead to a crisis. Environment, finance, migration, and then war at the end, and unresolved problems as a sign of the crisis in this society. So now I've said that. And at that moment, most people's adaptation to this normopathy no longer works. They are no longer as successful. Careers are no longer fulfilling because the general success of this society is dwindling. And now individuals are personally in crisis in their alienation, in their adaptation to a wrong social development, because they are no longer successful, because they are too insecure, because their adaptation no longer works. And that, in my opinion, is the reason why a large number of people today are once again intimidated by fear and allow themselves to be disciplined. They are made controllable by stirring up fears in them.
That is, because you no longer have self-confidence.
Exactly, and this has happened at least since the pandemic. Permanent fear was stirred up, where at the beginning one could think that this was perhaps a danger, but it was all so exaggerated. We have been bombarded with this fear by propaganda from morning to night. And that has now led to the real fear of many people. What will happen next? How will I cope when society is in crisis? Aha, now a virus, a danger? Now I have to throw myself into it and deal with it and do everything that is asked of me, lockdown and mask and vaccination and so on. In the illusion that we are not only protected and saved by a virus, which we now know is not true at all, but that this also overcomes and stabilizes the entire social crisis. So now we know it was all nonsense, it was a lie and a deception. People have been screwed over. Now climate comes next, and of course war. We still need permanent fear, stirring up fear, threat, so that people remain obedient and do not begin to think for themselves, but those who are afraid seek salvation, seek redemption, seek upwards. Help me, I can't do it alone anymore. And that, I think, is the explanation for the effectiveness of such absurd, destructive politics, self-destructive politics. Because we, the majority, participate, are tolerated, intimidated, and are kept dependent on our own fears and insecurities, which we all more or less have. But if this is now also the political plan to keep people in fear, then they will also be constantly destabilized and insecure with their own individual fears. And that is the reason why we are in danger of really developing a collective delusion, a threat delusion, and now want to save ourselves with bombs and tanks.
Mr. Masuth wanted to say something about it.
Yes, because you just said, Mr. Maaz, that many people are living the wrong life. And I believe that for many people, even the so-called pandemic really was an opportunity to lead a meaningful life. Because you've suddenly been told from above, denounce your neighbor, make sure no one walks at night and all that stuff.
Be obedient, exactly.
What did Mr. Brecht say? Citizens must function, never question measures, from Mr. Wheeler, all these things. So I really think that a lot of people think, yes, now I finally have a chance to lead a meaningful life.
Now I'm finally right because I'm adapted. Now I'm finally fulfilling parental, i.e., always authoritarian instructions. And indeed, many people felt comfortable and threatened. I experienced that. If you got on the train without a mask, I wasn't kicked out by the conductor, but rather by most people because I did something different. And they were so intimidated that they really thought I was a danger now.
Yes.
I think this is a really exciting point because this can be intimidating. Well, I didn't get vaccinated because it didn't convince me. I watched a lot of Sucharit Bhakti and Wolfgang Wodarg videos. Then I thought, nah, I'm not going to do it now. And then I noticed something that happens again and again, this group dynamic that Mr. Maaz described so aptly. And then we were under a bit of pressure in 2020 and 2021 as an unvaccinated person.
Well, that's how it was for me. There was always pressure.
And I don't know if it's inappropriate to say it so openly, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought some relief for the unvaccinated.
Von Russland in die Ukraine brachte eine gewisse Entlastung, ja, für die Ungeimpften.
Also, not that I would condone that. I just want to just observe what it was like.
Ich möchte nur einfach beobachten, wie es war, ja.
Suddenly you were no longer in the crosshairs, so to speak, but the Russian was in the crosshairs.
Then I always say it was most difficult for the unvaccinated Russians because they were always in the crosshairs. But the point is, the enemy images change very, very quickly. And over the last few years, because I'm always interested in how it works, I already said at 9/11 that there is endless fear. Towers that explode, and of course Osama bin Laden was the big story there. And the Bundeswehr absolutely has to go to Afghanistan for 20 years. And there, as with Corona, there was no in-depth analysis. They simply said that there was a great fear here. The government says what's what. And anyone who has dared to ask questions along the lines of a third building collapsed and no plane flew into it, then you immediately become a conspiracy theorist. In other words, I think the pattern is pretty obvious. A fear is created, fear of Muslim terrorists. And I just mean, if you had gone there in 2001 and they had said, I'm terrified of viruses, that wouldn't have been good purely in terms of timing because there was a different fear.
Just a weirdo.
Exactly. And if you don't have the current fear, then you will be socially excluded. But you have to look at what the current fear is, and that's my experience.
Ist meine Erfahrung.
And that's why I think what Mr. Maaz says is so apt. The fear is obviously always a different one, but when it is there, it acts as if it is the only one and forever and the universal one, and it changes.
And anyone who has been around for a while can see that. First there is fear of Muslim terrorists, then there is fear of viruses, and then overnight, bang, fear of Russians. And then when you're still in the fear of viruses and say, what, are we allowed to get together now? Now you have to come together and demonstrate against Putin, and then they say, but yesterday you said we shouldn't. You don't need to think for yourself.
However, an identity card is usually found in the end. Lucky, right?
What luck. So it's really like that. I've really looked into it.
I did a lot of research on 9/11, and the American media said that the planes crashed into the Twin Towers. And down at the Twin Towers, they found the passport of an assassin who was supposedly on the plane and was on the plane in...
You have to imagine it in purely physical terms. What luck, what luck. And then the same thing happens with the Andromeda, right? Then I always say, so if you put yourself in the head of an assassin, for example, and think, today we're going to blow up the Nord Stream, do I have the explosives? Yes, I have the diving device. What else am I missing? Passport? Yes. This is really... This whole narrative that is always presented to us is somehow an insult to enlightened thinking.
This is an insult, but also a test of stupidity. So you are tested as to what you can rely on, how far you can go in the way of seduction. Because I would like to add, for the salvation of humanity, of each individual. Also, Mr. Biden, that people really have problems, and the problems are real, and they are not you. They are outside of everyone. I think it's so difficult to pay for an apartment at all these days. These are struggles that people experience. Or this, if I take Biden now, this old man who has to act as president, and you don't know exactly which way to go and what to remember. When you see it from the individual, there is always a problem. And what outrages me about the news, I think you describe it wonderfully the same way it is done, is that they never have a problem. A war breaks out in the middle of Europe.
But there is no problem.
If Putin weren't so evil, the world would be fine. You can only say, what's the point? That's not news, it's not a story, it's not a narrative, it's just stupid. And there are different ways to see this process. For example, if I assume that the Donetsk Basin was a de facto state according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, namely, according to Jelinek's theory of elements, a state territory, a state people, and a state power. Ukraine had withdrawn from these eastern territories. They stopped paying wages and withdrew the police. You have no longer implemented any regulations in these areas. According to this rule, it would then be a state entity. Then the Russians would have defended this entity as a state after all. They were called upon to do so. Now, everyone is of the opinion that it is a case of aggression. But from a purely legal point of view, it could also be seen differently. I have to be in the media that...
What do you mean by being seen differently?
That Ukraine attacks the Donetsk Basin entity, which it did before the invasion. Exactly that. And I don't want to make a decision right now. But I want, and I also want as an individual, that the problem is presented to me and that I am not treated as stupid, as if I need a black man to be happy, who I have to be afraid of. And our culture is pumped full of black men, even if they are white old men.
At this point, I can't quite follow. Mr. Ganser, can you help me?
I can categorize something. So if a country invades another country, that is illegal. According to the UN Charter, all members, meaning the UN member states, refrain from any threat or use of force in their international relations. A concrete example, the attack by the USA under President Bush on Iraq in 2003 was a violation of international law because one country is not allowed to bomb another country.
And that has also been proven. There is no now.
Yes. That is the first point. Now, when a country is attacked, like Syria, for example, so Obama started bombing Assad in 2014, and Assad was then afraid that he would be overthrown from power by the USA. Then, according to Article 51, a country is allowed to defend itself and call for help from another country. And that's what Assad did. He called Vladimir Putin and said, "I'm being overthrown right now. Can you please help me?" And then the Russian Air Force went to Syria, but there was also the American Air Force. So Syria was already the first point of conflict. Ukraine was not the first point where the US and Russia met, but rather it was Syria.
And in Syria, they always made sure that they didn't clash directly because they are nuclear powers.
Atommächte sind.
And you can say,
da
and of
kann
course I
man,
agree,
das
that
sehe
this
ich,
is an act of
sehe
defense.
ich natürlich auch so, da kann man sagen, das ist ein Akt der Verteidigung.
The Russians were allowed to intervene in Syria because the elected government in Syria, Assad, called on the Russians for help.
Eben die Russen um Hilfe gerufen
And
haben.
now, if I understand you correctly, Ms. Gysi, you are saying that one can now argue in Ukraine, and I have also read such arguments that a new state has actually formed in the east of the country.
Sich ein neuer Staat gebildet hat.
I don't share this analysis now, do I? But I'm trying to understand how your argument runs, that you say, and this country, like Syria, has asked Russia for help. So the Donbass, that's Donetsk and Luhansk. These areas were fought over for 8 years. Yes, and a lot of people were killed in those 8 years. And of course, there are now also international law experts who argue as you do and who say, I don't share this view, but I think it's certainly valuable and right to talk about everything, because this is an analysis that says, would it be possible to see it that way? Putin has argued the same. He said, I recognize these two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent. And then he said, and they called me. So he actually played the Syria game. I say I'm not convinced, but why not talk about it? You should be able to talk about everything because we already had this discussion in Serbia. Yes, Germany bombed Serbia. At that time, Gerhard Schröder of the SPD was chancellor, and Fischer, Joschka Fischer of the Greens, attacked, and Clinton from the USA also joined in the bombing. The Belgians were also involved in the bombing, and everyone bombed Serbia. That was totally illegal.
And Schröder once admitted in an interview that this was contrary to international law.
Exactly, that was clearly illegal. Just as illegal as when the USA bombed Iraq. These are clear cases of illegal wars, and then they actually cut out a part of Serbia as well. And that is precisely this Kosovo. And the Russians always come back to this and say, yes, you also bombed, and then you also reduced the size of the country. And now we want to recall these things in Ukraine. Of course, you can reduce the size of a country. And then this was discussed in history in the context of international law. And people said, yes, but now there are two principles. One principle is that you cannot change national borders. That is a principle. And the other principle is that an ethnic group has the right to self-determination. So if somehow a part wants to secede, Scotland or Catalonia, or that happens everywhere, again and again, and then these two principles are opposed to each other, and then, in the case of Serbia and in the case of Kosovo, it was said that Kosovo has the right to secede. In other words, when you, Ms. Gysi, open up the complexity here, you can, yes. The complexity is really greater than just, we deliver leopard and then comes peace.
I think NATO also set a precedent back then. Didn't even your brother Gregor Gysi?
Yes, he drew a lot of attention to that at the time. Yes, he did today. But I think he sees it differently. But that's his business. And I don't even want to pretend to be an expert on international law. I just want to have all international legal positions presented as possibilities and don't want to live like a toddler with the bogeyman behind the curtain that I'm supposed to be afraid of. I don't have this fear. I don't want it. And I also refuse to be frightened. Only I know that you can have them full of worries with which you survive in this world. And that's why I get angry at the people who have the power to create such fear. And that's the first thing I do. They are also my colleagues because they direct. Every news report is a production. And then I think, sitting in front of it, why are they telling me this? I never think whether it's true or not. That's the second question, because it can be true, but it doesn't have to be. But the staging lies in the sequence. I still remember when the Greens at that time, I was still with Antje Vollmer at one of those party conferences they had, and then everyone ran very quickly to see what was on TV. They also came as a party conference, but in front of them somehow the construction, the very organizational, wonderful construction of something was shown. Then came this pile of chickens where everyone was running around, and then somehow oil broke out of some ship in the sea. It was quite clear the chicken pile can't do it. That was the production, and every message is in the context of a production. And that's why you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to tell me? What production is going on, and what problem is being hidden from me, as a small guide to consuming news?
Forget the staging of fears and problems. It is so successful as a means of power because, again, I assume from my work, I know the fears in us humans. So there isn't a single person who doesn't have fears. It doesn't have to be fear of mice or claustrophobia, but no. Am I good enough? Am I living right? Am I successful? Am I accomplishing what I set out to do? Almost everyone has this kind of insecurity, this anxiety about whether I'm living well, and that's why it's so politically effective to stage fears. As I said, we already have several, from the pandemic to climate and now war, because this puts people in the situation of being able to distract themselves from their individual fears and focus on the staged fear and now believe, aha, that's actually where it is great fear. And now I have to believe and trust my political leaders. They will do it. Yes, that's why people are ready for tanks to be sent and perhaps soon fighter jets, etc. Because yes, they'll do it. They'll save me, meaning that they're being saved by their own personal insecurities and fears because they now see the great danger that is being staged. And that's why I no longer ask myself, why are there no negotiations? The most sensible thing that could be done now, ceasefire negotiations, peace negotiations. No, because the war is needed, it is maintained, it is kept going artificially so that people have a chance to look from themselves, from their insecurities in life, to this great danger, and then to fight there and practically want to save the world.
That's right. And that's where I say we celebrate the war.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Mr. Masuth, you had just started like this and then...
Yes, I would like water.
I share it with you.
Very nice.
There you go.
Thank you.
Here you go. Yes. Still water.
German water?
Yes. That's supposed to be the next problem. I've just found it somewhere. There are these LED lines everywhere.
Yes, the privatization of water.
Exactly, the LED screens. I come from Hamburg and I always see something about water everywhere. I've just seen the water shortage. Or also interesting, there's a news service, even if it doesn't quite fit in with our program, but it's called Watson. And then you stand at a bus stop, look at it, and the news that was there, lake, a dried up lake in Canada now has water again. That was the news. And then you think, wow, which lake? Who was dried up? Where did the water come from? But that's what this subconscious is, this unconscious.
What is Canada?
What is Canada? Yes. Yes, I'm hearing fragmentation of information from the control room. Exactly. Yes, I would like to revisit the issue of who benefits, even though we have already addressed it. Cui bono? Sure, the arms industry. But once again, how is it possible that, well, normopathy is one explanation, but how is it still possible to convince so many people of this? Or how is it possible to prevent people from coming to their senses, to their awareness of what is really going on here, and that war, and that is now independent of whether it is Ukraine or whether it was Iraq or whatever war is not a solution.
Und das Krieg, und das ist jetzt unabhängig, ob das Ukraine oder ob das damals der Irak oder welcher Krieg auch immer, keine Lösung ist.
So I think this issue of we all want to belong also plays a big role. Yes, Ulrike Gero somehow mentioned it earlier when we were talking about majorities. Yes, so three people disagree with Ms. Gero, then they must be right somehow. So we can't get to the truth with majorities? Because if the majority really were, then the Earth would once have been a disk, only to become a sphere at some point. Yes, but this problem of being excluded somehow, we just want to belong. Mr. Maaz has somehow explained this very well in various interviews. And I mean, who likes to stand alone? Yes, you need standing, and you may also need a Mrs. Masuth who somehow says, yes, keep going.
Yes, or also
Basic social need.
Absolutely, we want to belong, naturally.
You have to.
A basic need.
After all, you can't survive on your own. So I have to say again, for us humans, we can't survive on our own, and we can't know everything on our own, and we can't judge everything either. And in this misery, we are constantly being made into idiots because we are asked to judge something that we cannot judge at all. And this is already starting on the talk shows with the trick. Yes, how would you do it? I asked the bus driver who was sitting there. I've always sat in front of it and said that he should now say, "Dear madam, gentlemen anyway, who has the power? If you give me your salary, if I have your employees, then I will think about it. And you drive a bus for so long?" And we are constantly in need.
Yes, but you've just said we're being turned into idiots. In other words, you could also say we're being turned into idiots. Which brings us back to personal responsibility, which I find so important.
So I think that would be interesting too. Maybe you could ask here.
Yes, we do. Afterwards, there will be...
I believe that the majority, most people, have a feeling that something is no longer right. So the way we used to live no longer works. And that is still a vague feeling. If you only hear one-sided news, you might think, oh, it'll all work out. But deep down, most people are unsure. What will happen? What will become of us? How will this society be able to develop or be saved? And this silent instability or stabilization of the actual sense of security is also not talked about. It's always just fear-mongering now. We have to save the climate and we have to fight the Russians, etc. And this basically covers up the real widespread insecurity, our way of life, our future.
Yes, ironed away.
Covered up, ironed away. And that's what makes most people so susceptible to following or not really protesting at the moment.
Can you then...
Why are we not on the streets against the war, but allow the few who still have the courage to protest against it to be defamed, because they reflect something that most people are touched by, but don't want to admit? We don't want to admit that this system in this form, let's say material growth, has reached a critical limit. That doesn't work.
Can we already speak of a mass psychosis?
Yeah, so I'm just being cautious as a psychiatrist, but the pandemic has taught me that you really do get away from a mass psychotic aberration, essentially by no longer perceiving reality. So distortion of reality is a central theme of a psychotic disorder. Yes, you live in your own world, and this world has been politically shaped. Yes, how you have to see the world. And most people have stopped thinking critically because of this uncertainty. So anxiety is a symptom of psychotic disorder, distortion of reality, and a permanent feeling of threat, yes. I've seen people standing at a distance in a queue, and then someone shortened the distance and they jumped back in fear. You have to imagine that. So what did that do to us? So that we humans were treated in such a way by this policy as if the next person was my enemy, the next person threatening my life, the next neighbor, the friend, the partner is now suddenly a danger to my life. You have to imagine this absurdity. It's psychotic in my eyes.
Is it true that humor is a good tool?
This is the most mature. I would then hand it over to Masuth, the professional here at the table. We are talking about psychic defensive processes, i.e., defense against not wanting to perceive something that one should actually perceive. And there are very primitive forms, such as division. The division is, you're the bad guy, not me, I'm the good guy. This is the most primitive form. But humor is really the most mature form of defense because it discharges, i.e., it releases energy into laughter, joy, fun, or something like that. But jokes live from the unconscious. Jokes are a discharge of the unconscious, which one does not dare to say directly and openly. So basically, you use encryption symbolization via a joke. But that is something wonderful. So I can only ever advise people, cultivate a sense of humor, share jokes. Yes, to get out of this inattention, to find, let's say, a more mature form of emotional liberation than going to war.
Mr. Masuth, you should be booming, but I've just heard today that you've been turned down for another job. That is, you would like to, but you are often not allowed to.
I'm often not allowed to, yes.
Because that's no longer funny.
No, it's no longer funny, but humor helps, even if it's no longer funny. Yes, it really is like this for me. In 2020, I somehow went to bed as a leftist and woke up tomorrow as a Nazi. Exactly. And these accusations are completely unfounded. Completely unfounded. If I may briefly tell you something personal.
Yes, with pleasure. The famous Angela Merkel speech took place on March 16th.
And then everything was closed. And then, I think in August, there were easing of measures. Then performances were gradually possible again. And I then proceeded as follows in my program. I said that we have a huge issue at the moment. The theme is Corona, but I don't want to talk about that as part of the program. Yes, but I would like to comment on this in the encore. Whoever wants to can stay. Of course they all stay. Everyone wants to know, what is he saying now? And what I did then was write a fictional speech for Angela Merkel.
I have to say, the director says he's always on the mic. So you can use it to write the program later, but I'll take it away now.
Okay.
And then I wrote a speech that I wish Angela Merkel had given on March 16.
Dear fellow citizens, we have a problem at the moment. The problem is called Corona. But viruses are nothing new. Viruses have been around forever, etc. What can we do? And then actually what is written in every normal health guide. Namely, exercise a lot, get plenty of fresh air, don't drink alcohol, go to bed early, etc. Laugh a lot, dance with whoever, etc. And everything that was forbidden to us would actually have been important to strengthen our health and our immune system. Exactly. And that was somehow an occasion. For example, I was playing at the Landestheater in Memmingen, and there was a riot in the foyer of the theater. I didn't notice it at all. I was in the dressing room, and then there was a really well-written review. So it would have been a nice performance and all, and only afterwards in the foyer would tempers have flared. And the director of the Landestheater Memmingen, Ms. Medler, Dr. Medler, felt compelled to write a counterstatement in the newspaper. And then there was talk of repeated anti-Semitic echoes, racist undertones, etc., etc., and she herself was not even in the program. Yes, it wasn't in the program. This will be posted somewhere on the internet and means that I won't get a gig in the Allgäu anymore.
This is the topic of information warfare.
Readers then say, "Oh, he's gone completely off the rails." And then there are emails saying, "You used to be a great cabaret artist and now you've become far right. That's bad." Yes, unfortunately, that's how it goes. And yes?
This is really crazy.
Yes, that's crazy. But that's exactly how it is.
It's used like a weapon.
Absolutely. Exactly. This is actually war.
Exactly. Again.
Yes, again.
But if we put it all together, the big question is whether there can be any hope at all that it will remain peaceful permanently and forever. So, I mean,
Oh, yes.
yes, it's in the air. There are two theories, if I understand correctly. There is always a certain cycle, as I understood you. And at a certain point, it all changes and we experience exactly the times we are experiencing right now. And then at some point, there has to be a bang, a war, so that reconstruction can take place afterwards. Mr. Masuth says it would be nice if we simply left out the war. Mr. Ganser talks about the human family, and not just 2 or 3 years ago. When did you come up with the term? Do you remember it yourself? In the cold shower?
Yes, for a long time.
But I think that the cycles are a historical statement.
Can we get out of this?
As a psychotherapist, I have to say the following. I am rather pessimistic, but not resigned. Well, yes. So what you really need to do politically would be to fundamentally improve childcare in the early years, after the reunification.
Sorry, I have to intervene here. For all those, that doesn't mean after half a year in the creche or after 1 year, correct?
Yes.
Just to be clear.
At least 3 years of family care, maternal care, father care, and these in turn must be financially and psychologically equipped as parents. Parenting skills, motherliness, fatherliness should be practiced because there are also really bad parents, and that doesn't have to be the case. But external care in the first 3 years is definitely bad, no matter how good the creche is. Definitely.
By the way, there is a Fair Talk program on this topic.
If I had better early childhood care as a political demand, I realized that it would never be implemented by the politicians in power. Because they are in power, because of their early disruption, their early traumatization.
Can you really say that in general terms? Can you say that in general terms?
Yes, you can. This is only possible in the case of a narcissistic disorder. Yes, that's now a broad term, ranging from my narcissism to her narcissism to a true narcissistic disorder.
This malignant narcissism?
But whoever comes to power must be narcissistic because first, he needs the sting to prevail to such an extent. A healthy person doesn't have that. He says, I would rather lie in the sun than constantly fight, get upset, and devalue others. And that is our politics in a game of democracy. I am the best, our party is the best, everyone else is bad. This is classic narcissism, self-aggrandizement and external devaluation. Only those who go along with this come to power. He cannot be expected to improve childcare because he would have to recognize for himself that I am a person affected. And the other problem is that even if I wanted to achieve this politically, I would have a lot to do with the parents. They would then also realize, gosh, I didn't really want that. A lot of things have gone wrong. I have had the most tragic experiences with parents who, as they say, really wanted the best for their children and didn't realize that this wasn't the best for them. You will then find yourself in a real dilemma. Well, I'd like to say that's a utopia to expect that, but you can wish for it. That's why I'm not resigned. It remains possible for each of us to learn to regulate some of the early damage we have of our own, especially narcissistic problems. You can't get rid of what's inside us anyway. But we can learn to understand it, to regulate it, and to get a practical grip on the extent to which we continue to exalt ourselves, or more, even in material terms.
And then to accept it and not feel guilty.
And not to devalue the other person, because the narcissist thrives on this. If the other person is worse, I am automatically better.
That seems to be the problem.
Yes, indeed. Each of us can learn what a benefit, what a pleasure, what a fun, what humor it is to get closer to other people. This is one of my most important therapeutic experiences. One more sentence. When people manage to get back in touch with themselves and thus with others, they are healthier and have more joie de vivre than if they had bought something new or had another great experience. That really is the case.
Mrs. Gysi, your word?
Yes, that's true, of course, but on the other hand, he has saved what he said before. We humans have a chance also in his structural conception. I just think it's so diverse. And at the moment, there is an attack on the family. And before I transcend the individual again, you can do that therapeutically. But you have to be aware that there is currently a cultural attack on the family, on the nation. When Mr. Schwab says that nothing will be the same in 2030, why? By what right? Maybe it should stay the same? So that's a declaration of war on the world. And that's why I disagree a little, because the individual problem can only be solved individually, with humor or with therapy, if you like. Or you are also happy as a human being. For example, I'm very lucky. Apparently, my parents were so happy when I was finally born that I still benefit from it today. And life is simply beautiful in the first place. And everyone is entitled to it.
You would also have misunderstood me if I had said I was pessimistic, but not resigned. I am not against the fight for this cause. I'm just a little pessimistic for the reasons I mentioned.
Good.
But the fight?
Then we're a good match.
You fight, I fight, we fight for what we think is necessary or good to actually achieve. And I always say that we can't save and change the world. But we can still communicate openly and honestly with at least 2 or 3 people in the small, let's say small parallel societies that we need and that we have to build now. That we actually exchange ideas, complement each other, confirm each other, and I don't need a social mask.
Super. I think we'll make our own format with you too.
Yes, that's really, in my opinion, it doesn't work. We can't save everyone, but we can stop doing certain things. And for our Western community of values, for example, I wish for one thing, that we leave others alone. Just leave it alone.
Yes, now a brief comment. So great, your plea for the family and also from you for the children. I think I've known this phrase for as long as I can remember. Children are the greatest good or our greatest good. Yes, and the sentence is nothing more than a hollow phrase. If you look at it, for example, there are cars that have sensors that ensure that the windshield wipers start automatically when it rains. But in our schools, buckets are set up in the gym or something to somehow catch the rain. And when I hear politicians who start off like this, children are the greatest good, then you can forget about them.
And then there's the next sentence. I sacrificed everything to you, my child. Yes, then you shouldn't have gotten one.
Michael Huther has in connection,
This is the childhood researcher.
and has said that never in the history of mankind has such a war been waged against children as has been waged during the pandemic. So that's
Another one, please.
yes, I really wish that I could live to see the perpetrators who have committed these crimes against children in recent years brought to justice.
Yes, I wish that too, Mr. Maaz. One more comment. 2 kindergartens or daycare centers in Weimar are to be closed down. It's somehow been all over the media. Immediate protests, yes, even on Theaterplatz last Friday. And that's how people lined up. But these are the same parents who have now spent 3 years maltreating their children with all kinds of measures. It's not about the kids. I think the parents who were there now also just want them to be able to organize their time freely. The children must be taken care of, ready. Yes, that's the point. Yes? And very briefly, and what you just said, that children up to the age of 3 somehow stay at home. We know, well, there's a former chairman of the German Psychiatric Society or something like that in our wider circle of acquaintances. Names don't matter now. In any case, years ago, they were commissioned by the federal government to research the best way to deal with children. This is exactly the kind of thing that comes out. Staying at home somehow for 3 years, parents are incredibly important and so on. The study has been done and then it ends up in a drawer somewhere and that's it. Bye.
Is it similar with children in Switzerland, Mr. Ganser? So your perception, I don't mean in your private environment, but in general?
So I also think, as Mr. Maaz said, so much went wrong during the coronavirus period in 2020 and 2021, and I don't have the feeling that we did any better in Switzerland. And I'm not of the opinion that we admit that yet. It's still like that, this feeling of it went really well, and then I think, no, it didn't go great. We have actually betrayed the entire principles of the Enlightenment. And the principles of Enlightenment are that if someone has a thesis, which they are allowed to have, they can say that SARS-CoV-2 is an extremely deadly virus. You can also go out with this thesis, but then you have to leave room for the counter thesis that someone else goes out and says, the mortality of this virus is not so extreme. And then it would be interesting to have a discussion between the experts. And then, of course, the question would be, how at risk are the different age groups? And the children in Switzerland were told, and I thought that was a big crime, yes, you're going to kill grandma. Yes, and I think it happened to you too. And of course, you can't say that to a child under any circumstances, because it's normal for grandparents to die beforehand, and you've already given the child the impression that if grandma dies, it's your fault. This is psychological warfare of the nastiest kind. And I really believe that we are at a point where we have to look back, where we have to say that all this scaremongering has led us to a point, and I might come back to the other point where you ask, yes, what happens next? We've now taken all this fear-mongering to a head, and it feels like, well, we can't keep this up much longer, can we? From one fear to the next, it exhausts us completely. And that's why I believe that we now perhaps have the opportunity to say, now we understand that, because we suffer so much from it that we then say, okay, the next fear, I'll give myself a break.
Dass wir dann wie evolutionär sagen, okay, die nächste Angst, da gönne ich mir eine Pause.
No, simply we see the pattern.
Wir sehen das Muster.
We see the pattern. If I take the last 25 years now, then we had the fear of 9/11, and many of us were there and perhaps fully involved. They said, wow, the Muslim terrorists, and whatever, taking off shoes at the airport and then fully participating. And
we've seen it everywhere. I can still remember that somehow Kieler Woche back then there were such big concrete bollards everywhere. And I asked a cab driver at some point, why are there these huge concrete blocks? Then he said, yes, because of terrorists. Then I just asked him, what if the terrorist comes by bike? He couldn't give me an answer. But it is irrational.
Simply irrational. But then when you've fully gone along with this fear, and above all it's full, it's probably better to observe it in yourself than in others. And then I say, how far did I go with that? Or then the fear that now during Corona, how big was my fear really of these viruses? Or now the fear of the Russians, and the next fear? I don't know how it is here, but here in Switzerland, the next fear is actually Credit Suisse, which is a big bank.
The banking crisis is the big issue.
The fear now is that you go to the ATM and your card pulls it in. And that was the last time you saw your card. And that is the fear. But I'm just saying that's how it is, that's how it feels. First the terrorists, then the viruses, then the Russians, then the money gone. And that is a state of stress that we as humans are not made for, but which is being fueled by the media at full throttle. And as a historian, I always say, could we go back and take a closer look at the last crisis? Because that's not true at all. They told it that way, and there was still WTC 7. Really, we don't have time for that now. We're in the financial crisis now. We can, in other words, we don't work through anything, but actually go from story to story to story. And I also have the feeling that the Corona story is not being processed again. No, it went really well. Now, Russia, we are supplying tanks. This works as well as vaccination. And then it really goes, it really is, it's a cadence. And my thesis, if I can put this on an optimistic note, is that it leads to a point where we say, no, I won't take part in the next crisis. I turn off the TV, I go into the forest, I sit under a tree, I meet good friends. It only takes 2 or 3, I really exchange ideas with them. I'm not going to tell them what the next crisis is because they really missed it. Of course, you become a bit socially isolated because you don't fully participate because, I don't know, aren't you afraid the money will disappear? And then you just have to say, no, I'm not taking part in this crisis. And then the friends will say, yes, you don't take this seriously. Then I would say very lovingly, I'll be back in the next crisis, but now.
Pause.
Yeah. Nein. That would be easy for me. The human being is we are already very intelligent beings, and we can really say, I've understood how it works. Yes, okay, then I'll change something. Of course, if we always go along with this in full, then we can't expect any relaxation. And I think everyone has to feel within themselves, how much energy do I have? Because I imagine someone would have been in Switzerland on the Alp with the cows, yes? In 2020, 2021, and then he comes down in 2023 and sees us in the cities fully finished. Yeah, he'd say, what's wrong with you guys? Yes? Yes, you don't know what we've been through. You haven't heard, have you?
So I would then take a photo of Lauterbach.
Yes, he doesn't know him. That's his luck. Yes, he doesn't know him.
He knows he doesn't have one. It just looks funny.
Yes.
But what I mean by that is that reality changes when you take yourself out of it. And of course, I now see more and more people saying that I'm not going to take part in this anymore. Okay, I'll do it. I'll continue my life, but I'll change my media consumption behavior. I'm also changing my anxiety behavior because I was there. I was totally on board with this fear. I feel a bit exhausted now at the next fear. I'm going to watch them a little bit from the side, but I don't go along with it anymore because you suddenly realize, the fear is over. And when you're still fully in it and have 4 masks on, and then suddenly it's Ukraine, then you don't feel taken seriously either, or do you?
But the question...
So I follow on from what Mr. Maaz says, that of course these fears are being stirred up because authoritarian structures are being established as a result, and people are smart enough. I think we are, of course, in a difficult situation on the one hand, but also in a very good one, because it has rarely been so obvious. Yes, the emperor is naked. He is naked, and you can see that. And then it's extremely important to me that you get out of this victim mindset and say, actually, I'm a perpetrator. I make my own decisions about my media consumption. I decide for myself who I talk to. I decide for myself which topics I talk about. And I also decide for myself whether I want to take part in a defamation campaign or not. I think a lot of exciting things are happening now, and my thesis would be that things are getting worse on the one hand, but better on the other. It's like 2 movements happening at the same time. Of course, this is a thesis for 2023, but we'll have to see where we are in 2030. But it could well be a moment of upheaval, where the massive pressure that we are all feeling, I absolutely agree with the others around the table. That is massive pressure. But quite honestly, it is precisely when people are under massive pressure that they reach their potential. Because then he has to say, okay, now I have to activate these resources that I've had with me for a long time, but I didn't need them in 2010, but I need them now. And then there really is a point of change where you use techniques that have been lying dormant. That would be my theory. Yes.
How important is it? I always notice that now, for example, we were just laughing together, also at the comment I made and with Mr. Lauterbach. And that's also, as I said, I'm a comedian too, to a certain extent always been. And yet, I think I would really like to have him here at this table, yes. Yes, no, seriously. I've often been criticized for this, but I say it anyway, and I mean it exactly as I say it, because I am convinced that we will only succeed in the end if we build bridges again. Yes, I'm not saying that it doesn't need to be dealt with. And what you said, that it is important that when crimes are committed, they are punished accordingly. Yes, just like everyone in a legal system, if I run a red light, I'm punished for it. And if I've done something worse, then I'm punished in the same way. But how do we manage to build a bridge, Mr. Maaz? How do we get out of this division and how do we come together again?
Yes, there really are 2 levels. I think in a really good democracy, the limit of what you are allowed to do is such 2 institutions, that is the penal code and psychiatry. So anyone who commits an offense under the law will be punished, and anyone who is ill, really ill, must be treated. Yes? Everything else in between is free, is fine, yes? In situations like this, when I think of Lauterbach, I naturally think, politically intolerable, he must be punished. But as a psychiatrist, he is a man in need, in the most serious need.
That's what I mean by that, and that's exactly that, seeing and recognizing that too.
I'm happy about that, so I can express my criticism. But if he came as a patient, for me it would be a person who needs help, and I want to give it to him as best I can. That is one of our main difficulties. How do we differentiate our own political or ideological, religious, moral stance from that of someone who comes to us and thinks quite differently? Yes? That is an eternal difficulty. And let's say there is no such thing as a neutral psychoanalyst. That's a false image. This is how I solve it for myself. If it is possible, and that is my work, that a person in distress, however unpleasant he may be to me, even if it is a murderer, I have also dealt with such people, I try to understand what is his innermost, most personal situation and motivation that has made him a criminal. And if that succeeds, if you stop just talking about the outside, that was wrong and that was bad and so on, but what is your motive? Why? What was going on inside you? Then he appears to me as a human being. Then, no matter what he has done, I have a human approach that makes it easier for me to look at the human aspect rather than the external differences. And that's where the chance of a bridge grows. That is a bridge then.
By the way, we invited him several times, not just once, for the record. So it doesn't mean you don't invite him either. Yes, we have. I don't know how often I would have to check, but definitely often enough. Mrs. Gysi, you are listening like this, smiling. And I'm curious to see what your solution is, how we can get out of this.
So I think you have to trust the world, you have to trust your own observations and be able to find words for them. And we must always try to understand the framework conditions in which we behave. Someone once said what I think is a very nice sentence. There are people who think in order to be right and people who think in order to understand something. And we also have to understand the framework conditions, the type of bureaucracy that is created, and we as humans must not sleep through what is coming. When we look at it, everything has already worked out. The way in which news is created is not news. So not just whether they are right or wrong. Nobody is on the spot anymore as we think. Something happens here, then journalist XYZ sees it. And then they talk about what they have seen now. They didn't see anything. They sit at the computer, they collect the news and sort it for our brains. And we have to learn to want to understand bureaucracies, as boring as it may seem at first. And there is, for example, a very good book by Richard Sennett, The Culture of Turbo-Capitalism. In it, he describes how hierarchical Weberian pyramids are destroyed and individual groups produce something. We should think of it like an MP3 player. One song here, one song there, one song there. Each song thinks for itself, I am the center of the world, and if I change that, something has happened. But the songs are only played when they are called up from the center. And that's where I learned, for example, to think about what power means, because it structures us, whether you like it or not. So Reuters determines what I think in the evening. It doesn't matter whether I think in opposition or in agreement. It is a requirement that is made there and that affects me. And I would like to say, gentlemen and ladies, that's not how it works. You fabricate the news like this, and in a backwards way that leaves me no room to judge anything. And I think that we have to learn to understand bureaucracies and what digitalization means for people in terms of the kind of information overload that they have to deal with. And that's difficult. I admit, that's how you become Inspector Hab-Acht.
But perhaps, as Mr. Ganser said, ignorance would also be a solution. It's easy to say, I'll sit this crisis out. I'm not involved.
If you see it from your own perspective, I don't find that difficult at all.
Yes.
Fuck you. But I still want to understand it. So it's not that I can reject the individual things that come my way, or that I can say, I can't change it. Because I have seen over 30 years the destruction of German theaters as a cost factor, and with it, unlearning how to read production. And I'm angry because I work in the theater. But now you have science. Now you have science with solutions. And that doesn't work, because that is the end of science. And then you can say, no, you don't want that.
Because then science becomes science.
Yes.
We're not in Kölle at all.
No, but you still have to try to understand it. And then I say, no, I'm not going to go along with that. That's a nice suggestion. Have a drink.
You deserve the final word as a humorist cabaret artist.
No, I mean, that's a nice sentence to say. I'm not going to take part in the next fear or the next number, but if you could decide that freely. But as we have now seen with the so-called pandemic, there are millions of people who could not have taken themselves out because they were in medical professions or in the armed forces, for example. They couldn't just say, no, I'm not going to take part. Not to this day exactly. In the Bundeswehr, vaccination is still compulsory. So I don't think it's that simple either. But the idea behind it is, of course, correct. Yes. I think it's great to just turn off the TV somehow and concentrate on other things. And what I also find very, very important, and I said this at the beginning, is that we need to start talking to each other again. We have to talk to each other. And I would like to hear from, no matter who is arguing now, I would just like to hear, well, I take the point of view because I don't just want to hear, that's the way it is. Rather, I would like to hear an explanation as to why someone makes a certain statement. And we haven't seen that for 3 years now. Simply not.
We have turned this into a real culture, which we call relationship culture, where we stop. So communication is everything really, to get out of fear. And this communication thrives on the fact that you stop talking about something. Neither about the other nor about one thing. Not pro and con, because both are always right and wrong at the same time, but only of himself. Because I think that way, because I am in favor of it, because I'm afraid of it, because... And this takes it from the factual level to an emotional, individual level. And that is where the opportunity for a real human encounter lies.
I would like to thank you very much for this incredibly exciting round of talks.
I really have to go to the ceramics now. Yes.
They also drank my water. By the way, the only one at the table who doesn't have to worry about a lack of water is Daniele Ganser, because it's still completely full. Take it with you to Basel, Mr. Ganser.
I'm completely relaxed. I have no pressure.
Thank you very much for this interview. Many thanks to Gabriele Gysi. A big thank you also goes to Dr. Daniele Ganser.
Thanks.
I'm glad to have learned this evening from Mr. Maaz, the expert, that humor is a solution. Many thanks to Uli Masuth. Thanks. And a big thank you goes to Dr. Hans-Joachim Maaz. Thank you very much. It's time for the big Q&A. Our audience here in Fellbach can ask our guests questions. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you for watching. I would like to thank the entire Fair Talk team for their efforts here. I would like to say thank you to everything that you don't see here at home, all the technology that was built up and all the effort that went into making this possible. Incidentally, this is only possible with your support, and I would also like to thank you very much for that. Have a nice evening and good night. See you here next time.
Auf Augenhöhe.